We are here in part because of the upcoming 10th anniversary of 9/11, and we've been asked to make known what our sense of the anniversary is. And in speaking to the Muslim community, which I'm a part of, there's a lot of talk about inclusion, about our place in the United States, because it's under fire. We're being targeted by the right wing. There's a sense of being under siege. And so far, not a lot of people have been speaking about the detainees and the civil liberties crisis that deepened right after 9/11. The work that I did after 9/11 at Islamic Circle of North America started out focused on families who had lost somebody in the disaster, in the attack, and those included about 22 Muslims who died, whose families I assisted to some extent, and who have been somewhat shy. Only one, Talat Hamdani, has really gone to the media, but a few others have appeared here and there. The total number is unknown, somewhere probably between 25 and 50 Muslims. We also assisted non-Muslims, people who were vulnerable, like undocumented. But then soon, as men began to disappear from our community, from our families, and from our corner store, my organization at that time was able to get a grant from Rockefeller Foundation and start making referrals to lawyers, start paying emergency rent to families who had lost their breadwinner. And over the years that I was there, the next maybe 3 or 4 years, we got involved to some extent in over 800 cases. I know other referral groups and legal assistance groups like ALDEF, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, assisted even more than that. Sun Yen Ling was remarkable. Other lawyers jumped in and were very helpful in the crisis that beset us. And I wouldn't want to leave people out, but there were so many. Brian Lonigan is one that comes to mind, but so many. We have lists and lists. And most offered pro bono services, some offered some free services, and the lawyers with us today were part of that noble effort. And many men, of course, even now, who may not have permanent status, don't have the so-called, aren't said to have the right in our system to have legal counsel. Seems to be treated as a privilege. And so many of them didn't have access to lawyers, and many of the families were plunged into a really deep fear, in part because families were being ostracized. There was a stigma on them. Sometimes people were being turned in by former wives and husbands and partners at work and so forth. Scores were being settled. Also, the police were stopping people on the street, driving cars, and also rounding out whole categories of people. Truck drivers with hazmat licenses, for example, seem to be seen as particularly risky. So men were disappearing. 1,200 in the first 2 months or so. Then other groups, the absconders group, 5,000. Other waves of detentions. Now, this is not to say that immigrants aren't detained and deported every year and in increasing numbers. And this is not to say that prisoners in our system are not imprisoned in unprecedented numbers. There is the human rights crisis is encompassing. Yet the special charged atmosphere after 9/11 targeting Muslims, also Arabs and South Asians, was certainly a very important leading edge to this movement to restrict liberties and to increase state powers, and also to continue to designate Muslims as the ultimate other. And we still live in that political moment, as you all know, with the Park 51 noise and hue and cry last summer, and the very many media cases. There is a threat of terrorism, and yet many of the cases we hear about are manufactured or are enticement cases, are sting operations. So to separate the hype from the real threat is difficult probably for the general public. So that's just a quick sense of my overview of it, but I think we hope to go back to the months right after 9/11 and the men that we knew over at that time and over the next few years, knew as lawyers, knew as activists, and in Irum Sheikh's case knew as a very, very impassioned, not just sister, but researcher and activist visiting these men after deportation. And I think it's a wonderful book, and I do hope that people afterwards will buy it, this Detained Without Cause. And I'm going to introduce her and also everyone in a moment. Just to also say that with us are Azmat Mohammed, Ansar Mahmood, Usman Nahid and family, Nabil Ayash, Mohammed, we won't say his name, and Yasser Ibrahim. And then Wael Kishk unfortunately couldn't make the book for various reasons, but was part of the research. And these men, in some ways representative of those who were detained and held in isolation cells and basically tortured without cause, as well as detained without cause. I hope they're with us today. And just to say, it's a little bit weird, but as I was looking at my files, and there was no reason for me to bring my files from that time, it's just a need I had to like cart them over. I didn't have time to really read through them, and it's too painful. But with my files in my closet at home, I found this coat, and I didn't tell you that I was going to do this, and it's maybe too weird, but this belonged to one of the detainees. The wife gave it to me after he was deported, Ali from Albany, and I've just kept it. I can't throw it away, and I think maybe this anniversary is time for it to go. It needs to go to a thrift shop unless someone wants it here. Please take it away. Anyway, so Irum's book, Detained Without Cause, I've known Irum now for many years, and as a friend, at first I thought, who is this woman who's doing this project? Can I trust her? Because it was a very scary time, and then she's more than proved that, and as you see in her bio, she's done many good projects and has been recently the Fulbright Scholar at Birzeit University in Palestine, and has been working on issues related to that. Sandra Nichols, to my right, is a private practice attorney working in New York City, and she's an immigration lawyer, and she was very active after 9/11, and I know her as a great lawyer who has had a huge Muslim clientele, especially at that time Sudanese, but many others as well, and be looking forward to hearing, and also a background in social work or clinic casework, which informs her work. And Marty Stoller is of course the former president of the New York City chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, and also a founding member of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and part of other boards, legal bar associations, but also very well known for so many years, since 1968 I think, with many famous cases, and your work is is appreciated. That's all we can say. And with your 9/11 work, I know you'll speak about that, but also your protection of the Hanshu agreement, even though that's been a challenge over 35 years. 40 years now. You're representing Black Panthers, civil rights activists, anti-Vietnam War protesters, Young Lords, welfare mothers, student activists, Diallo protesters, anti-Iraq war protesters, WEF protesters, and Vieques folks. No Republicans in there?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. Anyway, so we have a great panel, and I'll turn it over to Irum.
Great. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Adam and Liz for organizing this event, and to everybody who has been here. It's been, thank you so much for being here. I know Adam, Sandra, and Martin for about now 10 years. We've been working together, and they all were very helpful in me to publish this book. And without their help, I could not have been done that. I could not have been able to do it. So I really want to say thanks so much. Let's do the next slide. Today I just want to share some of the my research findings that I I did my research about individuals who were arrested after 9/11 wrongfully connected with the 9/11 attacks. And many of them were kept in the MDC jail that you all know in Brooklyn, the Metropolitan Detention Center. And there were about 18 of them. Just stay here for a minute. And as I interviewed them, and they told me about the stories of living in solitary confinement, many of them shared the story that how they were kept in solitary confinement and they were able to see the Statue of Liberty. And there was such a contradiction, how they could view the Statue of Liberty from a distance, and then they were placed in solitary confinement in a small cell, which was, they didn't have any access to a lawyer, or they were not able to make any phone calls, and all of beatings, and being able to just stay in solitary confinement for some people for about a year, that was a torture. So what I would like to do is to be able to provide you a brief overview about the book, first of all, and tell you few things, but I really want you to be able to hear their voices. So after doing my interviews for the book, I'm in a process of doing a documentary about them, and so I was able to go back to these people in their homes, and I did video interviews with them. So I want to be able to show you their clips, like what they have to say. And I want to be able to show you one clip in the beginning, and then I want to have both Sandra and Martin talk about their experiences, and maybe at the end I'll share another clip with you. So to begin with, what's included in the book? The book basically includes interviews with people and oral histories of individuals who were arrested right after September 11th, the 3-month period, which was a very chaotic time. And so I interviewed them, and I tried to understand, like, what happened, how were they arrested, and what I understand. Okay, go back. So within that time frame, as Adam mentioned, there are about 1,200 individuals who were arrested, and they were called special interest cases, which meant that they were linked, according to the U.S. government's assertion, they were linked to the 9/11 attacks. And as soon as they were linked to the 9/11 attacks, suddenly they became very secret cases. Like they couldn't have access to legal counseling, or limited access to legal counseling, and they were experienced harsh treatment also. Most of them, or almost all of them, were released then within the U.S., and then many of them were deported back to different countries, including Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey. These were the 3 main countries, and of course many other people were deported to Jordan, Palestine, Afghanistan, and many other countries also. None of them have been found guilty of having any link with the 9/11 attacks. And that is an important thing to make note of. And it's not only me who's saying it, the Office of Inspector General, who interviewed also Sandra, and I assume Martin also. And they also published the reports, and they confirmed that none of these people who were arrested right after 9/11 had any connection with the attacks. Can I do the next one? I just want to show. I want to clarify something, like what is included in the book, because there's so many different kinds of arrests that have happened after 9/11 that it is difficult to know who are these people. So, for example, people who were arrested outside the U.S., there are many governments which arrested their own people and then they either handed over to the U.S. or they kept within their own local jails. They are not part of this book. And I like to give an example of Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. Like, he was arrested from Pakistan in 2003. And after his arrest, he was kept in a secret prison for many years before he was transferred to Guantanamo. So the people who were arrested in local jails, the people who were placed in secret prisons, and there were many secret prisons which operated for a long period of time, or the people who were in Guantanamo. I did not talk to them, so they are not part of this part of this book. But there are many other scholarship, other books included, which talk about all those different kinds of arrests. So we have to be aware of those patterns of arrest, but they are not part of this scholarship. Also, there was okay, let's go with the next one. I wanted to very briefly talk about how I carried out my research before I get into the details. So I did my research. I interviewed about 40-some individuals who were arrested right after 9/11. So I went to some of the jails. I'm originally based in California. So I went to some jails in California, but because most of the people were arrested in New York, New Jersey area, so that's why I came here. And so I went to the jails in New Jersey, some in Pennsylvania also. And then many people who were released within the New York, New Jersey area, I interviewed them. And then I went out to Pakistan, Egypt, and then I also went to Palestine to interview many of these people who were deported back there. Along with talking to the people I interviewed, I talked to the lawyers, so that's how I ended up meeting Sandra and then Martin also. I also reviewed their files, legal files. And when I reviewed the legal files, that was very interesting for me to note. Like, while in the media, the media is talking, the journal media, mainstream media. Here, I'm not in talking about alternative media. They are talking about they are terrorists, but when you look at their legal files, they're primarily talking about immigration violations, or they're talking about credit card, or minor stuff like that. That's what was happening, and that was playing out in the courtrooms. I also tried to talk to the government officials. I was not very successful, as they were not interested in talking with me, but I was able to talk to 2 FBI agents, a few judges I was able to talk to, and I think that's all who were able to talk to me. Everybody else kind of did not want to talk to me. But I also used the scholarship of many people, along with many of the reports which were published by the Human Rights Watch, by Inspector General report, by many other reports which had confirmed the same information what the former detainees told me, which was that they were picked up on minor immigration or minor criminal charges, and then they were classified and framed as terrorists. Let's go next one. I want to briefly talk about how they were arrested, because that's kind of confirmed patterns of racial profiling, how these arrests occurred. And there were 2 primary modes of arrest. One was pure racial profiling. Am I stopping this thing? Yes, I am. One was pure racial profiling. Oh, you want me to slow down talking too fast? Okay, I'll try. Thank you. So there were primarily 2 modes of arrests. One was a pure racial profiling, which meant an officer, when they saw somebody who looked to them Muslim, which could be non-Muslim, it could be an Arab, could be Christian, or it could be a Latino, or it could be, like, there were like at least 5 Israelis who were in the MDC jail also. So anybody who looked to them a Muslim, they picked them up and they put them in, they wanted to investigate them. And after investigation, if they found out that they had any immigration violation, then they classified them, depending on the arbitrary mood of these intelligence officers, and they kept them in either in MDC or they put them in Paseo or other jails also. I many times try to bring out the situation of two of my brothers were investigated by the FBI agents, but since they were not, they were citizens, so that's why they were not placed in detention. If they were not citizens, I'm sure they would have been placed in detention also. Along with, so that was one mode of racial profiling and arresting people. The second mode was, and that's an interesting mode also, is through the FBI 1-800 number. You may remember right after 9/11, the government issued, if you see anything suspicious, call us. And many people, it's called TIPS program. I don't know if you remember it, but maybe you do. So many of the people called on the 1-800 number and said, by the way, we have this guy, I don't want to be racist, but we have somebody in our neighborhood who looks like, maybe suspicious, and he looks a little like Middle Eastern, or a little like, whatever. And the FBI would follow up on those tips. And again, the same pattern. If they had any kind of a problem with their immigration violation, or if sometimes one of the cases included in the book does not have any immigration violation. He had a valid green card, but then he was coerced to sign a document which said that he had helped his friend who had undocumented status. He had helped his friend to get a apartment. And under the 1996 law, helping undocumented immigrants is a felony. So that's how this guy with an even valid green card became subject to deportation. And he was deported after 3 years. Even we fought so hard because he had a valid green card. So some of those cases also happened. Now what I would like to do is to show you a clip which kind of helps you to see like how these people were arrested. This guy, his name is Nabil Ayash. He's in Palestine right now, and I interviewed him in 2008. He was in Philadelphia, and his story is included in the book, and he talks about his how he was arrested. After I finish showing the clip, I'm hoping that maybe both Sandra and Martin can talk about their experiences of what is happening now, because I really am interested in not only learning about what happened after 9/11, but understand what is happening today. But more interested, I am really interested, is that we really work towards some kind of reparations and apology for these people, because what happened to them was wrong, and it should never have happened. So then I'm gonna, after they finish conversation, I'm gonna come back and talk a little bit about the reparations and maybe understand the significance of that lawsuit.
I still wasn't satisfied. He said, just tell me. I said, I'm Arabic. And he said, you're under arrest. That's what happened exactly.
Next day they woke us up early, and he said, well, get ready because you're being transferred. And we asked, why being transferred? We're supposed to be here until we see an immigration judge. They said, well, don't ask too many questions. And then other agents, they come in. They were not immigration agents. They were like heavily armed. They had shotguns and machine guns and everything. They wore helmets. They were vests, bulletproof vests, and they were very harsh. They took us out, one guy at a time, handcuffs, shackles, and a chain on the waist. And things were really becoming even uglier than it was the day before. They were really, really harsh. The first thing that came to my mind is that this can be happening. you know, the sequence when you are confronted with something that's really shocking, you get shocked at the beginning, and then you go into the denial phase, that this is not happening. I had the denial phase for like 2 days after that, and I really thought that this was some kind of a movie or something. You know, for a minute I was unconscious. I mean, like, you know, I didn't know if this was really happening or it is a really bad nightmare. And but I was very scared. And it was really, until that moment, I wasn't that scared. But at that point, I knew that something really ugly was going to happen.
Let me talk a little bit, as Irum asked, about what's happening now with them. About I represented over 24 post 9/11 detainees, both in New Jersey and at the MDC. And the situation of their arrests and what happened to them are as she would describe. MDC was particularly harsh. I actually was not able to comfortably interview my client. I wisely decided that probably I was being audio taped against our Constitution and all our other, and so I avoided asking any questions that I didn't want to hear the answers to. And later on it was confirmed that they were in fact audio taping attorney interviews in MDC. Most of my clients were deported. One of my goals was to see how fast I could get them out of here, because it was obvious that there was no way, once I interviewed them, that they were going to be able to stay legally. And even that was difficult. One time I had to go into court, federal district court, with a writ of habeas to get my client taken from the airport to the airport. It took him 4 months. They had his plane ticket. He had already agreed to voluntary departure, and it still took him 4 months to take him to the plane. And he was ready to go voluntarily. Since then, I've had at least one client return, because at the time that my client was detained, he had a girlfriend, and she subsequently went to his home country and married him and sponsored him to come back to the United States. And he came back with his temporary conditional green card. 2 years later, they contacted me because he was attempting to remove the condition on his green card, and immigration was once again thinking that he was a threat to our security. The first time he got arrested was because he made the mistake of enrolling in an airplane mechanic class and starting it on September 10th. And the second time, with the conditional green card, he was driving a truck. And so it was obvious that they were hyper-vigilant with him because of his connection to 9/11. I have had another client. I managed to get his case administratively closed indefinitely, fortunately, but most of my clients were detained. Now the government has finally stopped NSEER's registration as of about a month ago. Are you familiar with that? Well, the first wave of what they were doing was post 9/11 detainees, and then about a year after that, the government announced that all men from certain designated countries had to come in for registration, any male between the age, I believe, of 17 and about 45. And they started off with the 7 countries that they hated the most, including my client's country, Sudan, and then they expanded out from there into, I think, ultimately about 22 countries. And anybody who went in who was not in legal immigration status ended up being placed into removal proceedings. And it was a trap, and the men were caught in this catch-22, where if they didn't go in, they were going to face deportation, and if they did go in, they were going to be facing deportation. A large number of people in the Pakistani community went up to Canada at that point, trying to avoid the registration. But that's finally ended. which I guess they finally decided they were tired of the manpower hours. Because it wasn't proving anything, they weren't actually identifying anybody that was worth investigating, so they finally stopped. They've been focusing more in on people who have been giving material assistance to terrorist organizations, and because the definition of a terrorist organization is one where anytime 2 or more people come together and discuss the overthrow of a government using firearms and explosives, that is now a terrorist organization. And there's no distinction between a friendly country or a country where we'd really like to see some of these groups overthrow a government which is not a responsible, good government. Most of my Sudanese clients have had to wait for 7 to 9 years to get their green cards, simply because somebody in immigration decided that any member of the major political parties was giving material support because the political parties themselves formed a coalition shortly after Bashir came into power. And one of the other members of the group was the SPLA, the Southern People's Liberation Army, which we have decided, even though we gave them arms and gave them support, was a terrorist organization because they had child soldiers. So because the SPLA was a member of the same coalition with these other, it's like the Republicans and the Democrats, really, that everybody who was a member of the Republicans and the Democrats was giving material support. And they took them all of these years, at least 6 years, to make a decision that they really were okay and they could get their green card. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing very aggressive prosecution of anybody who might be a persecutor. And this includes people such as the Sierra Leoneans who were imprisoned by the rebels, the RUF rebels, and then forced to be porters or digging for diamonds. And they're charging those captives with being persecutors. Those are the kinds of things that I'm seeing more recently. It's still taking longer than normal for people from the designated countries to get clearances. It can take up to a year or more before they can get an interview for adjustment of status or citizenship. Whereas somebody else who is from another country might only have to wait 6 to 8 months for an interview. So there's a significant difference, and they are still being targeted. Those are the major things that I've seen more recently.
Hi. I'm Marty Stoller. I am primarily a criminal defense lawyer, and that's pretty much how I got involved in representing people who were detained after September 11th. So let me give you just a couple of war stories, just to give you the feel of what it was like back then. My first contact came with a young man who came to the U.S. on a visitor's visa. He's in his mid-20s, from Egypt, pretty much of a ne'er-do-well, the son of a fairly well-connected Air Force colonel in Egypt. And he came to New York, or actually he came to the Baltimore area, I think really looking to try to find a wife. That's what he came for. After September 11th, he was about to check out of a hotel to come up to New York. He was in a motel, and he put his baggage outside his door, and he sort of left it there for a moment while he went to try to get a cab. The hotel clerk decided that there was something suspicious about this young man and called the local police. The local police, when they heard that his luggage had been found outside his door and that he was from, or it looked like he was from, the Middle East, called the FBI. The FBI then picks him up, interrogates him, and makes him a material witness. A material witness, in normal circumstances, is a witness who is likely to flee. That is, somebody who has testimony to offer, but is not likely to be responsive to a subpoena or a request to have them testify in court. Well, they made Ahmed, this young man from Egypt, into a material witness, and I was assigned to represent him in the court at 40 Center Street, the Federal District Court. And so I'm assigned. I hadn't met the gentleman before. I walk into court, which is a closed proceeding because theoretically it's connected with a grand jury proceeding investigating a particular crime. And in walks this young man accompanied by 3 or 4 guards, completely shackled, handcuffed, waist chains, shackles around his ankles, and being pushed around and treated like a piece of garbage. Right away, I thought there was a little problem here. So then I stood up in front of the judge, or I asked the prosecutor, I said, well, why is this guy being held? Why is he material witness? What makes you think that he's got something to say, and what makes you think that he's not going to be responsive to a regular subpoena? Why is he in custody? The government's response was, I'm sorry, the affidavit in support of his arrest as a material witness is sealed. It's secret, and we can't show it to you. I said, wait a minute, I'm his lawyer. I'm supposed to represent the guy. How can I even think about whether he's a proper material witness or not unless I see the affidavit? They said, sorry, it's very secret, it's very sealed, you can't see it. At which point I said, well, that's it. I'm not representing him. Tell the judge to come out, and I'll tell her that I'm getting out of this case because you won't show me the affidavit. That was the mentality of the government, that they've arrested somebody on an affidavit, allegedly claiming that he's involved somehow in 9/11, but his lawyer can't see the charges against him. And he wasn't charged. He was just held as a witness. Ultimately, the judge relented. She said, okay, I'll let you see the affidavit, but it stays under seal, and you have to pick it up from the U.S. Attorney's Office. When you go discuss it with your client, you can discuss it with your client, but you have to put the affidavit back in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You can't keep a copy of it. So I finally got the affidavit, and because it's still sealed and I'm under that kind of an injunction, I can't describe to you what was in the affidavit. But what I can tell you is that it was as thin as this. It was garbage. It was nonsense. The guy was not a material witness, and we later find out that John Ashcroft and the Justice Department had abused the material witness law and used the material witness law to incarcerate and hold people who would otherwise have been free to roam around the country. Ultimately, the young man, through a lot of effort, convinced the government that he had nothing to do with nothing. He was a guy who was here looking for a wife. And ultimately he was released, of course, put into deportation, because they found that he had a warrant outstanding on a trip that he'd come to New York 3 years before, and he'd failed to pay a $25 fine on a disorderly conduct charge. Therefore, they transferred him into state custody, ultimately back into federal custody, and ultimately deported him back to Egypt. But he spent about 2 months in the SHU. That's the special housing unit where people are locked down 23 hours a day, treated roughly whenever they come out of the SHU, whenever they come out of their cages, essentially is what it is. They're shackled, and they're treated around and treated as if they are animals. These are not human beings, these are animals. The second experience that I had came a little bit after I met this gentleman who was the material witness, when folks at the Center for Constitutional Rights, who had started to represent some of the detainees, on behalf of this gentleman who was from Pakistan originally but who resided in Canada, he'd been detained long enough, and they filed a writ of habeas corpus to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't hold somebody without charges. And he hadn't been charged with a thing. You can't hold somebody without charges. You can't hold him on an immigration thing because you don't have any immigration stuff on him. Release him. He's illegally being held. The government's response to his illegally being held was to indict him, to charge him with a crime. The crime being working without proper papers. Shakir ultimately, having been detained for that long a period of time, we decided maybe he should plead guilty to having worked without his papers, and indeed that's what he did. He was given time served and ultimately went back to Canada. But he was also treated like an animal for having done nothing. A little bit after I dealt with him, I dealt with another man who I'll call Mobashir. Mobashir had come on who was a Pakistani, had come from England with his passport, had come into New York on his way to visit his brother in Pennsylvania. He was here on a visitor's visa. While he was in New York on his way to Pennsylvania, he did what most tourists do. He came before September 11th. He walked around New York City and he took pictures with his little camera. Remember when they had film? Well, that's what he had. He had film in the camera. And he went around, he took pictures, among other things, he took pictures of the World Trade Center, which is essentially a major, or was essentially a major tourist attraction. So he does his stuff in New York and he plays tourist, and then he goes down to Pennsylvania to be with his brother, and lo and behold, of course, he takes the film to a developing place and gives the film to the developing place. The developer looks at the film as the film was being done, and he sees that this man who looks Middle Eastern, who's actually a Pakistani from South Asia, but he looked Middle Eastern to the film clerk. The film clerk developing the film sees that this man has got pictures of the World Trade Center. So he calls the FBI. The guy is immediately picked up by the FBI, thrown into the SHU at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, and again, treated like an animal. Completely treated like an animal. This one, the only way we got him out of the SHU was that turns out, they claimed that he came into the U.S. on a false passport, and he was charged in Pennsylvania with having a false passport. The way to get him out of the SHU was to waive any right he had to challenge the charges in Pennsylvania and say, okay, get out of here, go to Pennsylvania, we'll get you a lawyer there, and you'll deal with your false passport case. The fourth gentleman that I had, who is in the book, a gentleman named Ansar Mahmood. Ansar came to the U.S. essentially running away from some very bad things that had happened in his home country in Pakistan. He'd been set upon for political reasons, and he was an outsider. So he came to New York, and he came with his wife. He worked his way up from being a taxi driver to becoming an owner of a truck. After 9/11, and he moved into this wonderful neighborhood in New Jersey with his wife and his 3 children, and was the most square-ass, middle-class American you have ever seen. Driving his truck, moving into the neighborhood so that his kids could go to school across the street. The bad piece of advice that he got shortly after he got here from some idiot was that in order to apply for political asylum, you have to wait 5 years. So he came to the U.S., did not apply for political asylum, but went to work as a taxi driver, and ultimately working his way up to having his own truck. He got picked up after 9/11, and his story is pretty much in the book. But what is shocking about what happened is that all the things that are normal to him got turned around against him because he was Muslim and because he was from Pakistan. So when he tried to get bail when he was picked up and he was brought into immigration court, the argument for not giving him bail was that here's a Muslim with a hazardous materials license. He's got to be dangerous because of that. Well, for goodness sakes, the guy's a professional truck driver. Of course he's got a hazmat license. His boss requires him to have one. They also told the immigration judge that this man had refused to go to Washington after September 11th, or shortly before September 11th, or on September 11th. He was supposed to drive a load to Washington, and he refused to go. Obviously, that means that he knew something about what had happened at the Pentagon. Well, a little bit of investigation turned out that he'd been told by his boss, don't drive the load to Washington, the Pentagon's been bombed. They didn't tell that to the immigration judge. They turned it around, and the immigration judge, as every other judge that we've all been before, post 9/11, determined that he's a Muslim, therefore he's got a connection to terrorism solely by virtue of the fact that he's a Muslim. The most outstanding example of that is what happened to Ansar Mahmood's children. His 2 older children went to school across the street from where they lived. They had friends, they played baseball, they were the most Americanized Pakistanis you've ever seen. right? After September 11th, their classmates, these 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids, started calling them terrorists. Kids, they were called terrorists solely because they were Muslims. When I first met Ansar, and I went to see him at MDC, he says to me, I can't believe this is happening to me. This is America. This can't happen in America. And from his perspective, he's right. Like many other immigrants, he came to the United States because of a belief that somehow in the United States there's a tremendous amount of freedom, that it's different, that America is a different place, that there is a lot more tolerance in America, that there are not the kinds of ethnic divisions that take place. Well, unfortunately, Ansar learned that being a Muslim after 9/11 in America is something which will get you looked at askance. There is no distinction, the way the government looks at Muslims and the way a lot of people look at Muslims, between all the various different branches and beliefs and what people subscribe to as their beliefs in Islam. No distinction at all. If you're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. And I saw that most dramatically in a case that I tried in 2006. I represented a young man who had been set up by the New York City Police Department into a plot to blow up the 34th Street subway station at Herald Square. He was entrapped. And I'm a very experienced criminal lawyer. And I've tried a lot of cases, and I've tried entrapment cases. And let me tell you, a lot of people think that entrapment is a nonsense defense. This was not a nonsense defense. This is a young man who had been talked into something by a guy who was twice his age, who was working for the New York City Police Department. So I had to pick a jury in an entrapment defense, and so I convinced the judge to use a questionnaire in trying to select a fair jury in the case. We brought in 500 prospective jurors to try the case, and this is in 2006. Right? 500 prospective jurors. We gave them the questionnaire. One of the questions on the questionnaire, or several of the questions on the questionnaire, had to do with whether they could be fair and impartial to a defendant who is a Muslim. Fully 50% of the questionnaires, 50% of the jurors who were brought in were tossed out because the amount of anti-Muslim venom that surfaced as they answered these questions on the questionnaire was so bad and so distasteful that even the prosecutor, who was trying to get a conviction in the case, had to agree that at least half of the people had to be tossed out. What we found, or what I find, is that the reasons for all the detentions that took place after 9/11 pretty much had to do with a political decision on the part of John Ashcroft and the other folks, that they had to come up with some sort of an excuse to excuse their failure to prevent what happened on 9/11. And their political way to do that was to target every single Muslim male and say, if you're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. And if you're not supporting us in our attempts to get the Muslims, then you must be supporting the terrorists too. Those kinds of distinctions were made. The government was allowed to get away with it. It's an absolute tragedy as to what happened. The best analogy happened in World War II when people who were Japanese, Japanese Americans, or any relation to Japanese were put in internment camps. This is what our government did. This is the America that Ansar Mahmoud said, this can't be happening to me. We put Japanese in internment camps, not because they did anything, but because they were Japanese. The same analogy takes place in the 50s, where the communists were all of a sudden the enemy. The communists were today's terrorists. And all the branches of communism, or all the shades of communism, anybody who was even had liberal political thoughts was thought of as a fellow traveler or a pinko. It was a way to label somebody an outsider and to make government efforts to marginalize them much, much easier. That's what's happening today with Muslims. We now have a whole set of rules and regulations which generally govern our constitutional structure and the way we prosecute people and the way we investigate crimes, which don't count anymore because we're investigating terrorism. I would venture to say there is not a single mosque in New York City that doesn't have at least one undercover agent or informant who goes to prayers on Friday, who goes to prayers daily, and reports on what's said in the mosque, who is there, and what people around the mosque are saying. All this information gets fed back in, and so if you go to the mosque for prayers on a Friday, you wind up in the New York City Police Department intelligence files or the FBI intelligence files. What happens is a tremendous division in the community is caused because nobody trusts anybody. Nobody can open their mouths and say things which, if it's the slightest bit different than what the government's line is, people are going to look at them a little bit askance and say, you're a Muslim, you must be a terrorist if you're disagreeing with governmental policies. Or if you're standing up for your rights, you must be a terrorist, because who else would assert the Fifth Amendment except the terrorist? So that the term terrorist becomes essentially a word that says anybody who is potentially looks like a terrorist, smells like a terrorist, talks like a terrorist, has the religion of a terrorist. Anybody who is a Muslim is a potential terrorist, and that makes them less than human. That's what justified the detentions that took place after 9/11. 1,200 men, essentially, who had absolutely no connection to any kind of criminal conduct other than passport violations, bad Social Security cards, working without a permit, the kinds of things that never would have been uncovered by anybody except for the fact that they were Muslim and they drew the attention of law enforcement. What to do about this? Don't let them do it to you. Stand up and speak out and say how unfair this is. Speak out about how it is improper to racially and ethnically profile people, and don't let them use the word terrorism as a substitute for the word criminal. If somebody commits a crime, charge them in court with a crime. Don't label them a terrorist and lock them away in some secret prison and make them less than human. That is not the America that Ansar Mahmoud talked about. It's not the America that we want, and it's certainly not the America that I want, and it's not the America that I stand up and yell about all the time to make this country pay attention to the principles upon which it was founded. And those principles are that Muslims, as much as Catholics, Jews, Buddhists, Confucianisms, whoever you want, are no different than anybody else. They're no different. Because somebody has a religion, because somebody comes from a certain country, doesn't make them less than a human. We are all in this together. The U.S. is supposed to be the melting pot. Let it all melt, and don't let them get away with making the kinds of distinctions that can characterize one particular ethnic or religious group as outsiders and as dangerous people.
Thanks, Marty, for stirring that melting pot. I think that is needed to cook it right. But I want to, before Irum speaks again, maybe on how people are doing after their deportation, a little bit like that. I think it would be just to say that as I started to think about this panel, I was going through some of the old, business cards, and one of the first people I tried to contact was Joel Dranov. Unfortunately, he's passed away, and so it was sort of a real reminder. He had helped some of these same detainees and really stepped in, and that time is passing, and we need to really make sure that we're learning lessons and passing on lessons and sharing this information, because the 20th anniversary, what will that be? Will there be any reparations? Will there be any apology? A lot of the detainees have said to me, maybe they don't care about the winning a lawsuit so much. They want an apology, and I hope they get both. But what kind of justice will they get? And I think a lot of us have sensed a disappointment in among many of the detainees who have stayed in touch by email, that they haven't been recognized as being done wrong, except by some of us, that the government doesn't seem to be acknowledging this, even though we have a new administration. Suleiman Olakadun, a Nigerian student, turned in by his school at Maritime, part of SUNY. I recall Drum, Desi's Rising Up and Moving, was very active on his case, organizing students. There were many people who were turned in, and really, he had Quranic tapes in his car, but the real issue was that he hadn't paid his bill entirely. And so, people were really treated badly. Some were tortured when they were sent back, and I believe one of the cases in the book was tortured. And actually, I won't go into the details, but then there was one of the cases that I worked on very intensely, Nabil Al-Marab, a different Nabil, and I recently visited him in Syria after not seeing him for almost 9 years or so. He was put in the shoe, and he was held under pent bomb, and it was a real high security kind of classification. Eventually, after 6 months or more, he was determined to be a material witness and testified somewhere. But he was not linked to 9/11. He had been to Afghanistan once. But this whole thing, when he was deported to Syria, eventually he was disappeared in Syria. The intelligence officers got him, and he disappeared, and his family didn't know where he was for a year. Now he's out. He's looking for a wife. He wants to settle down. He's trying to bounce back, and it's great to see that resilience, but it comes at a cost. It really does. And he would like justice. He's asked me to try to figure out about his confiscated goods. Many years have passed now. It's probably not possible. He had a bank account. What happens to your bank account when you get deported? A lot of those things were let go, and now it's kind of late for that, but he wants his justice in that form, and in fact, ALDAF is trying to help with the bank account issue. The sense of the hunger for justice, but also the feelings. I was wondering if Irum could speak about what it was like to visit them afterwards.
Thanks, Adam. I'll just briefly talk about my experience of talking with these people when I visited them back home. But then I want to show you a clip of one of the guys, Yasser Ibrahim, who you saw in Egypt, who is part of a lawsuit. There is a pending lawsuit. It's a class action lawsuit, which is Center for Constitutional Rights is fighting for that lawsuit, and he talks about the importance and the significance of that lawsuit. And at this time, this lawsuit is pretty limited, and I think what is really important is to have a reparation and apology for all of the people who were arrested after 9/11. And I think we should have a conversation more about it, and also make sure that this kind of, let me just go back. Remember, as Martin talked about the internment of Japanese Americans, and how over 100,000 Japanese, and many of them were citizens, were interned. After 9/11, that kind of a mass internment didn't happen for Muslims. And I believe that part of the reason it didn't happen, that after 40 years, in 1988, the U.S. government apologized and paid reparations to Japanese Americans. It took them 40-some years, and whatever happened, that was unjust. It should never have happened. But that apology and reparations, I think, was one of the reasons that stopped the mass internment and mass deportation and mass detentions of Muslims after 9/11. Not the same way that happened after World War II. But what happened after 9/11 was also terrible. It should not have happened. Even 1,200, 5,000, even one person being locked up just because he looks or has a certain religious background is a violation, and is not in conformance with the American spirit, that we want to make America, what we want to stand up for America. So I think what we really need to work towards is to make sure that these men who were arrested, they are given reparations. There's an apology, an official apology. So we learn, the government learns a little bit more from here. So in the future, when we have some kind of another wartime emergency, and I'm hoping that nothing will happen, but it could happen. And maybe there's another kind of a background, another different phase, which is going to become an enemy. That another phase, another ethnic group will not suffer the same way the Muslims are suffering today, or especially the way they suffered after 9/11. So why don't I can describe what these individuals feel. Of course, there's a lot of stigmatization that went along after they were arrested, especially in terms of 9/11. And even when they were cleared of the 9/11 attacks, they were deported on the charges, "Oh, you have done something wrong." Like they were criminalized. So when they went back their homes, many of them felt shame. Many of them did not want to share their stories also. It took a courage to be able to talk about their stories, because they felt how the people would see them. They would see them. They did not want to tell people, we were in jail. Staying in jail is not a pleasant experience. And no matter how you explain it, you cannot explain it to the world outside also. It's hard to even explain it in the U.S. Think about people living outside the world and explaining, I was racially profiled because I looked this way, and they put me in a high security jail because I had an expired visa. It's very difficult for people back home even to accept that story. So there's a lot of shame that they live in. And as they live in a shame, of course, there's a mental anguish. Sometimes they're outcast, and there's multiple psychological problems that they live with also, along with the fact there's an economic hardship, there are other hardships also. So I'm going to talk about, I asked Yasser Ibrahim, and you can maybe play the clip right after talk. I asked, he's a part of the lawsuit. Basically, he settled just very recently, and the government paid him about $300,000 for being placed in solitary confinement at MDC. At that time, he had not, the time when I interviewed him, he had not signed the settlement. So I asked him, what's the significance of this lawsuit for you? So he responds to that, and let me play this for you so that you could hear what's the importance for him.
Too many significances to me. The first one is to prove to everybody that was involved that he was wrong, or she was wrong. Okay? That you cannot, in the 21st century, start dealing with people according to their colors or according to their background. It's not true. It's, the whole profiling thing is not correct. And on the personal level, I need to prove that to everybody else, my friends, my family, even the authorities here in Egypt, that I was really been under very unfair treatment, and that I was really innocent. I mean, my release is considered a declaration of my innocence, of course, but I need an apology. That's what I need for all the mistreatment. Because seeing my brother being beaten up or sleeping hungry, it's not gonna be like, it's not an easy thing. I don't know any other way to erase all these memories but to win this lawsuit.
I just had a question, maybe from the legal perspective, about more mundane and I guess more subtle issues that come up for Muslims living in America, and especially people who are already citizens. And the three short examples I can think of is, one, the UC Irvine case, where 7 students from the Muslim Student Association were arrested for basically protesting during the the Israeli ambassador coming to speak at UC Irvine. They were arrested for basically, shouting out during his speech, and things that come up for MSAs, Muslim Student Associations across the country, to stuff like Park 51 or Palo Heights or all the different mosques across the country having problems with like zoning laws, and also Boston, it was a huge issue in the early 2000s. And then the third thing was, there was a Times article that just came up about these laws against like Sharia law, and talking about how when states put up votes on something like banning international laws because they're afraid of Sharia laws, how stuff like this blocks people from getting their religious rights recognized, like a halal butcher holding someone accountable for actually bringing him halal meat. So how do lawyers deal with these kind of bigger and more murky issues of protecting, I guess, religious rights and I guess basic civil rights for people who are Muslims in these kind of confusing situations?
I'll take a shot at it. Going on to 3 examples, the fact that the students got arrested at a speech where their opposition to the speaker was dramatic, and that resulted in their arrest, that's not necessarily because they were Muslims. That's because they opened their mouths and protested. The same thing happens with the President of the United States, particularly George Bush, when he comes to town, and people get up and speak, and people are hustled out and arrested. You get up in the gallery in Congress, and you have something to say, you get arrested. All right? The fact that they were Muslims and the fact that they were speaking out, I think, is all in their favor. And I hope they turned it around and used the legal case against them to continue dealing with the political point that they were trying to make by speaking out. So I don't see that one particularly as something that is dealing with Muslims. The Park 51 business and some of the zoning stuff that goes on is totally outside of my ken as a lawyer. But as a human being, I think it's totally outrageous. It's a cover-up for racial discrimination. That's all it is. It's just a cover-up. They can talk about how we don't want it zoned this way, or we don't want it zoned that way, or it's going to be too many parking spots, or it's going to take away our on-street parking if you let this be built here. Zoning is something that traditionally in this country has been used to essentially divide people and to allow wealthy communities to remain wealthy and to keep poor communities poor. That it's being used against Muslims, against Park 51, against other places that want to build a mosque is totally outrageous, completely outrageous. And the interdenominational other religions in this country, the people who build churches and temples ought to stand up and yell and scream about the fact that the zoning laws are being used essentially in a way that is discriminatory. The third point you raise, which I'll try to address a little bit, it gets a little, the question had to do with states passing laws that prohibit their judges from applying Sharia law. Well, first of all, nobody's ever applied Sharia law. It's a straw man. It's nonsense. It's setting up something that is not real. It doesn't apply. International law, laws of other countries, are sometimes looked at by judges in this country as advisory, as to see how somebody else has done something to sort of give me an idea about what it is. But American law takes its roots from American law. And the only time that international law becomes something that's binding in United States courts is if the United States government enters into a treaty. And treaties become the supreme law of the land. So what you have is a bunch of people in various state legislatures who are pandering, really pandering to the most base common denominator, which is hate somebody who's different than you. If you hate somebody who's different than you, then vote for me. That's essentially what they're saying. The whole notion that Sharia law or any other body of law would be something that would be applied by a judge in this country to either a civil case or a criminal case before him is ridiculous. It's a total canard. It's really absurd. I would use a stronger word, but we're in mixed company, so I won't.
Council of American Islamic Relations CARE New York chapter is doing a Know Your Rights training tomorrow in Brooklyn with attorney Lamis Deek, who has done a number of good Know Your Rights trainings. And so this kind of thing is needed, but also a lot of advocacy, a lot of community organizing to raise the level of pushback. Because there's a lot of money now in nativism. There's a lot of money flowing into these think tanks that existed before 9/11, but have been really propelled by the internet and by hate and by politics into very powerful positions now in our politics. So whether it's Daniel Pipes or any of I think today there is a report issued by the Southern Poverty Law Center about these hate groups again, called Jihad Against Islam. It's an interesting title, but again, there's this kind of impassioned movement to stigmatize Muslims. It's more developed and more resourced than it was after 9/11. But it's a continuation. Other questions? Yeah.
Hand-wringing and liberal and activist communities about how we've sacrificed essential American ideals in these practices. But as many of you pointed out, we have a long, sordid history of scapegoating in this way when it comes to political opponents. I would argue that the witch hunt is a quintessentially American paradigm. So my question to the lawyers, I'm curious, to what extent do you have faith in the law to be able to withstand cultural tidal waves when sentiment turns against class of people? Do you think that if we had stronger laws, they would be able to withstand the movement, or is this an essential part of American culture or culture more generally to be able to influence law in that way? Or maybe a philosophical question about
I think what I saw happening right after 9/11 was people were, it's still true to some extent, but more so then, people were terrified. And they wanted the security of knowing something was being done to protect them. And I think in the long run, the law comes back around and corrects some of those constitutional violations with the lawsuits and things like that. But short term, it was really difficult to fight what was going on or do anything. I will say, I think one of the things that surprised me, considering the number, almost my entire clientele is Muslim, and most of them are from the Sudan, which is one of the worst countries. So when I was representing all the detainees, I was very afraid that my office might have been bugged. And I almost got it swept, but I found out it would cost $2,000 to do that, and I didn't have it. But the government has never come after me in any way because of my representation. They went after Lynn Stewart, but given the number of clients I had, I thought I might run into problems, and I didn't. And I would say that on the plus side, that I didn't have problems.
I was just curious because you all talk to judges, and this is something I have no idea about. This would be my question: is what are judges thinking? Do they buy into all of this? They're all different. They're all individual.
Yeah.
And you guys have relationships with them, so I know you need to be careful. But what about the judges? Do they believe all this?
Well, in immigration court, I saw some judges that were normally fairly liberal, pretty frightened, and more conservative right after 9/11, but that's not a long-term thing. That was a short-term. Right after 9/11, they were afraid that 26 Federal Plaza was going to get attacked, and they were antsy. But long-term, they're fair. I haven't noticed a big change because of 9/11.
My experience is, this is not subjects that we normally sit down and have a chat with the judge about. There are some judges who are okay on this, and there are some who will go along with whatever the government says. The government says these are terrorists. The government says they have no rights. The judges will go straight along with that. There's at least one federal district judge who refers to some of the Muslim defendants before him as towel heads. which is pretty outrageous for somebody who's got a life tenure appointment and who's put in a position of being able to judge cases that involve people's liberty or cases that involve millions of dollars. That's pretty outrageous. So the answer is I don't know. And the question about faith in the law is a very difficult question, and it's a question I as a lawyer struggle with all the time. I don't have a whole lot of faith in the law. The American system of justice is racist, it is classist, and it's pervasive throughout the system. So what I wind up doing is trying to make the system live up to its best ideals. And that's what I'm always ranting and raving about, is that like America has these wonderful ideals, let's live up to it and make them real. And that's how I approach judges. I don't care what their politics are, I want them to follow the rules. The rules say you need probable cause to arrest somebody. Don't arrest somebody because they look funny. Give me some reason that you're arresting them, and I'm okay with that.
I think her question is also, do we need stronger laws?
If the question is do we need stronger laws, we need people who are willing to enforce stronger laws. Right? If you want stronger laws, then you wind up with the USA Patriot Act, which totally takes away and erodes our civil liberties. The way to get back to that, in some sense, is to find judges who will say that certain elements of the more restrictive laws are unconstitutional, or to change the legislatures who pass the laws. Aside from revolution, which is a whole other story.
I know you have hands up, and I want to be able to respect those questions. But in terms of judges, I did talk to one or two, and I want to read one testimony that is in the book. There's an encounter that I found from the trial transcripts. I reviewed the trial transcripts, and there's a conversation between Yasser Ibrahim, this guy, and the judge. He's an immigration judge. And I want to read it to you so that you would have an understanding what happens. And many people complained about this particular judge. I wouldn't give his name. Right now, I think he still operates in New York, because I think he was brought in specially for the MDC jail to work with these detainees, because maybe he had certain orders given and he knew that he could able to carry out those orders. I'm going to just read this. Yasser Ibrahim says, this is in records. Sir, one of the guards was bringing me here. He was pushing me to the walls, and he was saying, quote, if it wasn't for the camera, I would have smashed your face, blah, 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 and bad words. And the judge responds, okay, stop and let me explain. I don't run this detention center, and there's not much I can do that. So, you have an attorney? If you think there is a complaint that you should make, Ms. Young can make the complaint for you. I don't work here. I work in Manhattan, and I don't run this building or supervise these officers. You understand? Telling me isn't going to add anything to your case. There was some, and then he continues on. He says, Ms. Young, I disagree. I think there's a misunderstanding. The purpose of this record is for me to make decisions about things I have authority to make decisions about. If you have something to complain about that, I could encourage you to make the complaint to someone who has the authority to deal with it. As I have explained to your client, I don't. It doesn't really belong in this record, okay? So I think in my research I did find judges who were very prejudiced. And so I think that's one of the evidence and that I was able to find in records. It doesn't mean that the other judges were not like that. And so much of the stuff that happened, they can make an excuse to say, I don't have an authority on this detention center and I can't do anything. I really want to ask these lawyers, because I'm not a lawyer, is that really possible for the judges to just turn their face away because there's an abuse, a physical abuse going on, and they cannot do anything about it?
Yeah, the immigration judge has very limited power. He's an administrative judge within the Justice Department, and he can only rule on immigration law. He can't even make a judgment about whether or not there's a violation of our constitutional rights. If If you think there's a violation of due process, he can't do anything with that. You have to wait until you get into federal court to make a constitutional challenge. They really have very limited power. They're about one step up from a hearing officer. You know, just to tell you, they don't have any say over that detention center. But, you know, he could have been more instructive about what the respondent could have done.
Well, my experience with federal district judges is that they have the power to do pretty much anything they want, but they exercise it in a very, very narrow field. If you want to complain to a judge about the conditions of confinement that your client is being held under, the judge will listen to that in the federal district court only to the extent that it makes the proceeding in front of the judge easier to conduct. So that if you go in front of a judge and you say, look, my client has been given all this pretrial discovery on compact discs, and he hasn't been able to view it because he doesn't have a computer to look at the discs in his cell, the judge will order the jail to let the guy have time in the law library so he can look at the discs on the computer. In the case of my young man, who was accused and ultimately convicted of the conspiracy to blow up the 34th Street subway, he spent about 15 months in solitary, in the SHU, as an accused detainee, somebody who was indicted for a crime. And all he was concerned about was the conditions of his confinement. It was difficult to talk to him about his case. It was difficult to get him to focus on the tapes that the confidential informant had done. And I started complaining to the judge about how this is going to really affect his ability to be a witness for himself, and it affects his ability to have the adequate assistance of counsel, because all he wants to talk about is the conditions of his confinement, and I can't get him to focus on the case. The judge, looking at that, says, oh my God, maybe we got a problem here. I'm going to get a conviction. It's going to be reversed on appeal. I'll reach out. And the way she reached out was to reach out to the prosecutor, to say to the prosecutor, can't you do something about this? And the prosecutor got in touch with the MDC people and put the kid back in population. But only after 15 months that he was held there, and only after 2 or 3 months of me complaining that there was no way I could adequately prepare his case for trial as long as he was in the SHU. So some judges will pay attention to it, but only if it meets their own particular needs. That's my experience.
I would like to make a suggestion for what would help in the future. And I have here education and large, low renters. Immigrants coming here need to study the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote all these beautiful words. You're one person in the state was saying, I can't believe this is happening in America. So he heard about these beautiful words. But at the same time, Jefferson and most of the founding fathers owned slaves. So you can have an education piece when people are migrating here to study the history of this country. And then I put down the Native Americans, study how they were betrayed and genocide was perpetuated against them. So you won't have these ideas of you're in the heaven because it's America. I teach that you should really emphasize education for the migrating people. The other thing is the 13th Amendment. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. You should have some, when you're going to get your reparations or if you put in the appeal for it, what is some money for trauma? Because from what I was hearing from everyone on the panel and the state, people have been traumatized, and so they need some support. And it might take not just 1 year, it might take 10 years to get some money put aside for them and maybe confidential, because not everyone wants to say, I was beat up in prison or I was killed, what I'm saying? They might not want to say what happened to them. But I think it would be really helpful if you had that in mind, recovery. And one last point.
That was your last
question.
That was your last. Let somebody else.
This is very important. I wouldn't say it. The 13th Amendment. I think I'm saying you need people to study this more. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But do you know the clause? It has except for people who have done something for which they would be punished. And so what happened is Africans who were newly free were walking down the street and the police came, these wonderful people that everybody trusts, grabbed them, said you're loitering, put them on in convict labor. They spend their lives laboring for free. So I really, if you could possibly just use the education piece, that would help.
All right, thank you. Education and the lessons needed. Yes.
Two brief things. Since Adam mentioned the Know Your Rights workshop that CARE New York is doing tomorrow, CARE New York is asking community groups and whatever kind of organizations that might be interested in Know Your Rights sessions to please contact them and they'll help set it up. So Google CARE New York or look for their Facebook. The other thing is there a way that we can all help out with this effort that you described for reparations? Because I think that is so important in terms of turning the tables politically and helping us go at least to a limited extent on the offensive. So how can we get involved with that?
I don't know that there's, political movement. At this time, we really need to start a political movement.
But at the same time, I think that there's only a class action lawsuit. That's the one that Center for Constitutional Rights is running. And I guess if we could maybe write letters or maybe make it a political movement, we're capable of doing it. There was the civil rights movement. Out of that, the reparations came. I guess we need another civil rights movement to be able to change the political climate in the country. So I don't have an easy answer for this, but and I think we could do some stuff. It's not like it's not possible, but at this time what I know of is only one class action lawsuit. So that's all what I know of.
Oh.
Yeah, I think you have to start it.
I think there are a lot of allies, out in the community, and I recognize some from here, documentary filmmakers and journalists, and I see you, brother, over there, and also, there are tools, films about detainees that exist that are really quite good, and I think that, if you go online, you can find them, and some of them are just available online. From Nicolas Rossier's film, Brothers and Others, which was the first one, I think, that came out, but then, at least 6 or 7 other films that came out, Persons of Interest, etc., which give voice, as your book does, to the detainees, who lets them speak. And I think that's important that more and more people see that, so that Muslims and also all prisoners are not demonized. Some people don't want to know this, won't come to the program, don't want to hear this. We need to speak to them, we need to talk to them. And I appreciate the journalists who are doing the right thing, and I told Marianne I would put her on the spot real briefly. Sorry, almost done, and here you are. Just because working for WNYC, you went ahead and you did something a little bit similar to what Irum did, and I just wanted to give you a chance to just really briefly say what you did.
Thank you. I don't think I can add very much. I mean, there was so much said here tonight, but I did follow. I actually interviewed Marty's first client in prison, and I followed several deportees back to Pakistan, met them when they were coming off the plane, and no radio, pure radio. So, and I've been in touch with some of them recently, and I think some of the sentiments that I've heard is very similar to what you're saying about that it's very, what some of the people you wrote about said, that it's very difficult to rid yourself of this trauma, but also the sense that people are suspicious of you partly because, the lawsuit, one of them was part of the lawsuit that pretty much failed as it is. One of them particularly still has a sense that people are watching him, that he is an innocent person, and this is a forever case rather than something that ended. Is that true?
Well, yeah, I think I know what you mean, and I think that this is an ongoing responsibility that we share to reach out to people who feel this way, who have been mistreated, and in whatever way. But I hope we can include this group of men and families, in all the work we do, we're kept busy. Groups like CARE and National Lawyers Guild and so forth are kept very busy reacting to things that come down. And but somehow, as we think ahead to next steps, I hope, again, we can keep this group of men who were mistreated right after 9/11 and who continue to be mistreated, and new people who continue to be arrested unfairly and detained without cause. Let's keep them in mind, and they're with us in spirit. So thank you very much for coming today. And please buy the book.